So proudly we hail at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rockets' red glare, the bombs bursting
Happy New Year, everybody. Even though we've kind of got a sad moment. Jack Morrow, a life well lived. A life well lived. He was a consummate gentleman, and always a pleasure to see that smiling face as we come through the door. So we're going to move on. We've got a presenter that has presented to us before, and in fact came as a non-member and liked us all so much he became a member, which is a good thing. So, for 39 years, this gentleman was the movie and theater critic for the Tribune Review, the Pittsburgh Press, and he's an all-around good guy, and he's going to talk about some of the greatest movies ever. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Ed Blank. Let him run with it.
I've got to tell you, it's reassuring to me that something hasn't changed over the course of my 79 years. And that is that the bad guys in class always sit in the back. Well, knowing I was going to be talking to you today, I kept a notepad beside me, jotting down the names of great films, one by one as I'd think of them, not all in one sitting. And I made a list, a 3-page list, and I printed 80 copies of it up at Kinko's or wherever. And so I'll make them available in the back of the room when we're finished. But I'll tell you, as soon as I got home, I got annoyed as hell with me for the ones that I had not thought of before I had the print job done. Judgment at Nuremberg, and my 2 all-time favorite police detective movies are not on here, The French Connection and Bullet. But, you know, you just don't think of everything, and I'd come up with about 100 here, so. Anyway, I have often wondered what it is that shapes tastes. There's a great website called the Internet Movie Database, IMDb. And you can go on there and check the full credits of any movie that's ever been made. And they have a composite rating of all the people who have ever voted from 1 point to 10 points for it. And you can put in your own rating and it'll be tabulated by the next morning. And the greatest movies ever made, look them up, they all have thousands of ones. And I wonder who in the world could have given that movie a 1? It is so damn good, or at least so very entertaining. But any of them who have more than a few hundred votes have many, many 1s and 2s, and it just doesn't make any sense. But I've always wondered how how people can disagree on something that is conspicuously good. I can understand in the case of bad, because there are always elements in bad movies that appeal to people for one reason or another. But the great ones, I don't know, I can't even broach arguments. And you wonder, how much of it is genetic? How much is it what you've been exposed to when you were 5, 10, 15 years old? How are tastes shaped? And shouldn't they be identical for identical twins who are raised together? What makes one person appreciate fully something that is well worth appreciating, and in another case, no interest at all? I've got all of my 10 all-time favorites on this list, and at the last minute I thought, oh geez, I didn't designate which ones they are. So I put a star beside each of the main 10. And what I found, and I've known this to be true for a long time, I think more great movies were made in the 1950s than at any other time. And I think the key factor there is that that's when my tastes were being shaped. I was taken to a lot of movies when I was a kid. The first two I saw ever were the re-release of The Wizard of Oz, which I guess we've all seen, and the re-release of Disney's Pinocchio. Those two impressed me quite a lot. I think they were the ones who gave me the idea, geez, I gotta get taken to as many movies as I can. And I think I might have told this story the last time, so I'll just repeat this one thing. It was the end of my first grade year at Sacred Heart Grade School in Shadyside, and Sister Mary Antonine asked us all to pop up out of our seats for a minute and say what we wanted to do for a living. And I happened to be seated in the last seat in the third row. So there were 11 kids, 11 leading up to me, and then 11 and 11 more. And the boys were trying to, nobody wanted attention back there, at least not in a classroom situation. And the boys whose fathers were attorneys and doctors were standing up and saying, I want to be a doctor. And the more blue-collar boys were saying, I want to be a policeman, I want to be a fireman. And the girls, remember this was the spring of 1950, and the girls were saying things that were pretty much gender-specific. I want to be a secretary, I want to be a stewardess, I want to be a nun, I want to be a housewife. And a lot of them were barely moving their butts off their seats when they did this, you know, fireman, and back down again. And I thought, I can't say it that fast. So when it came my turn, I stood up and I said, I want to be the next drama editor at the Pittsburgh Press. And the whole process stopped, and every kid turned around to stare at this weird one in the back of the room. And I don't know how many of them became doctors or police officers, but that's exactly what I wanted to do, and I think the fact that I was single-minded had a lot to do with the fact that I got to do it, because I was always focused on getting there to do that particular thing when my time came. Almost everything I revered came from that period, because I think with certain movies shaping my tastes way back when, they were inevitably going to remain favorites. And the great majority of the stuff that was produced afterwards could not quite meet the standards set by the things that, to me, were excellent in the first place. That's not to say that I didn't see some really good movies every year until 2022, maybe 2021, 20. I'm seeing fewer movies by the year, and as somebody who used to see virtually everything, now mind you, there were things that opened on double features directly at drive-in theaters, but you know, mainly cheap horror films and cheap westerns. But I used to see everything I could, and in the past year, 2022, I saw a total of 8 movies. Hard for me to believe myself, but you know, so much you see advertised on TV now goes direct onto pay cable channels that you can't see unless you subscribe to them anyway. But my all-time favorite filmmaker, by far, hands down, was Alfred Hitchcock. And I can remember the first night I saw in East Liberty, the old Enright Theater in East Liberty, I was taken to see Hitchcock's Strangers on a Train. And that knocked my socks off. And after that, I had to see every Hitchcock film. And I did, by hook or by crook. And one after another, they impressed me so much that I realized the element I appreciated most in movies was suspense. And Hitchcock was the master of suspense. I was taken to a lot of different movies when I was a kid and not allowed to go on my own yet. A lot of them were MGM musicals, more MGM than any other film company, because somehow that was an element that appealed to older members of my family. But, and I'm going to save for last my all-time favorite. But among the Hitchcock films, and there were so many that I really enjoyed, North by Northwest and Psycho and Dial M for Murder and so on. The two I think hold up best today that I loved from the very beginning were Rear Window with Jimmy Stewart and Grace Kelly. What a classy couple. And I never met or had any communication with Grace Kelly. She went off to be a princess before I was in any position to look for an interview with her. Jimmy Stewart was a real gentleman. And although I don't think he was the best actor of his generation, I think that was Spencer Tracy. And the actor with the greatest versatility, I think, was Robert De Niro, who I never had any contact with. He didn't talk to the people in Pittsburgh. The actor who I could identify with most readily was Jimmy Stewart, because although he played principled characters, they were always vulnerable. You always had the sense that, unlike, say, John Wayne or Errol Flynn or other guys who played superheroes of their kind, Stewart was vulnerable. He might get hurt in some way or lose something, or I had an opportunity to talk with him on the phone a couple of times, but the main experience of him was going up to his 75th birthday party when they had it in his hometown of Indiana, PA. And I remember we were talking. I said, was there anything you were offered that you turned down and later regretted? And oddly enough, his answer was something I didn't think all that much of. He said, yeah, I was to do Designing Woman, which I wanted to do because it would have reunited me with Grace Kelly. But just before we were to make that, she went off to become Princess Grace, and I backed out of it. He said, I thought Betty Bacall and Greg Peck made a pretty good movie of it. I might disagree to some degree with that, but you were a real gentleman. I think the best screenplay of all time, any kind of film, adapted from a book, original, whatever, was Joe Mankiewicz's script for All About Eve in 1950. And beautifully played by a cast headed by Bette Davis. And any time that is on, I bow to it and leave it on because it's such a pleasure to listen to the dialogue in that. 1959 was one of my favorite years, and that was the year Hitchcock's North by Northwest came in second to a movie I appreciate even more, and that was Otto Preminger's Anatomy of a Murder, which I think is the best courtroom film ever made. Again, Jimmy Stewart with gorgeous Lee Remick, and Ben Gazzara and several other, George C. Scott really made his mark in that one. excellent piece of work, cunningly written and based on a bestseller, well worth doubling back to read afterwards. I had very strict parents, and I often didn't get to see things that I really wanted to see when I was a kid. For example, Jane Russell and Marilyn Monroe, both of whom were off limits to me, worked together once in Gentlemen Prefer Blondes. I have been watching that for the rest of my life. But I was not allowed to see that in 1953 when I was 9 years old. But it happened to be double featured at the Regent in East Liberty with a movie I was allowed to see called Mr. Scoutmaster, with Clifton Webb as an ill-chosen scoutmaster. And one of my older sisters took me to see that. Mr. Scoutmaster came on first. It was like the noon movie. And we saw that, and then we had to leave. Gentlemen Prefer Blondes came on. So we sat through the cartoon and the trailers, and Gentlemen Prefer Blondes was just starting. And the two of us are walking up the center aisle, both of us looking over our shoulders, watching the screen. And about 30 years later, my sister said to me, "Man, was I sorry you were with me that day, because I wanted to see that too." I did get to see some things that you would have thought were off limits to a kid back then. And one of them, because it had such a great reputation, was From Here to Eternity. And that was just a knockout. One of the times that the voting members of the Motion Picture Academy got right, the one that they voted Best Picture of the Year. And one of the things that impressed me so much about that was the performance of Montgomery Clift, who ironically was wildly miscast as a great boxer, but gave a sensational performance of the qualities of the character he played, Robert E. Lee Pruitt. Very, very moving film. And even if he was, in a sense, miscast there, he carried it off so well that his performance is, for me, the centerpiece of that film, and the reason I appreciate it especially much. The very next year, Columbia, which had made From Here to Eternity, Columbia won again for that great film, On the Waterfront, which was the best example I've ever seen of a kind of naturalistic acting, which was encouraged by the director Elia Kazan. And Brando knocked my socks off in that film. I came to think he was just about the worst actor in Hollywood. He became more and more and more self-indulgent, and almost nobody he worked with could bear to be around him because he was so involved with himself. He didn't care about what anybody else was doing or fitting into the picture of whatever they were doing. He just was. He would get into fistfights with other actors on films because he was so discourteous. It was already in place when he was doing On the Waterfront, because all of his stuff was done, they'd shoot a scene with all the actors in it, and then they'd break off and do close-ups of this one or that one saying the same lines. And perhaps the most famous scene in that movie, On the Waterfront, the cab scene with Rod Steiger. Steiger said, "My God, he was just terrible to work with. He wouldn't feed me my lines. He wouldn't even sit there while I was doing my part. Somebody else had to come in and do." He was to become so self-indulgent. I think he shouldn't even have been nominated for The Godfather, which famously, when he won the Oscar for that, he sent Sacheen Littlefellow to reject the Oscar for him. Talk about pretentiousness. Whoa. But in On the Waterfront, I thought he was sheer perfection. The absolute apex of an actor's studio performance. Best epic ever made, boy, there are a few you could pick. I'm sure some would say Lawrence of Arabia. A huge success was Ben-Hur, but for me, the best epic ever made was Dr. Zhivago, which I thought had the most romantic thing I've ever seen done in a movie. When Yuri Zhivago is about to lose the love of his life, Lara. He's never going to see her again, and she's going off in this vehicle with Rod Steiger as Komarovsky. He's a bad guy, and Zhivago, knowing he's not going to see her again, they've been living in this ice palace. I mean, it is covered with ice. And he goes into the house and runs up the stairs and can't see through the window to watch the carriage going up over the top of the hill. And he breaks the window in this place. And I thought, man, that's love. From the first time I saw West Side Story, it was a 1961 release. Like many films, it's New York and Los Angeles get films in December that the rest of the country get at the end of January. And that was the case. They want it to be fresh in theaters when nominations come out and so on. And I went to see West Side Story the first Wednesday matinee. It was running reserve seat down at the Nixon. Totally knocked me out. I was a great appreciator of musicals anyway, and I already knew the score to that one. But what always stimulated me most when watching musicals was the choreography. And Jerome Robbins' work on that film was just a knockout. I loved seeing on the wide screen the Jets and the Sharks and their girls doing these big choreographed dance numbers. And from that day in 1962 until the beginning of the 20th century, I always identified that as my all-time favorite movie. And I've seen it 42 times on big screens. I'm not talking about television and buying the VHS and then the Laserdisc and then the DVD. But I saw it 40 times in theaters over the years. And 2 other times in situations like this where I'd take a movie with it and show it to a group. And the 43rd time was in a class of my own when I was teaching in the Osher program out at Pitt. Best foreign film I've ever seen, easily, hands down, Giuseppe Tornatore's Cinema Paradiso, which is about a boy falling in love with the movies in this small town Italian cinema, and his experience of growing up, watching movies, loving them, befriending the elderly, crotchety projectionist, and doing everything he can to have access to the movies, and I sure identified with that. Just such a beautifully done movie, Cinema Paradiso. But the all-time favorite, oddly enough, I saw it in 1952. It was the biggest box office success of the 1940s when people had taste. They weren't worried about Avatar and Tom Cruise in some dumb damn Top Gun Maverick. The top grossing movie of the 40s was released in 1946, and it won Best Picture, and it was the best years of our lives. And it was re-released in 1952, and I was taken to see it. And so impressed, so moved by that. The novel was set in Cincinnati, Ohio. The movie, the city is never specified. It's some small town in middle America. And it's about 3 dissimilar guys coming back from World War II and trying to adjust to life in their towns, with essentially surrounded by people who had no idea what they'd been through. And I was always, one of them was played by Frederick March, who went back to his banking career. And one was played by Harold Russell, who really did not have 2 arms, but he didn't lose them in World War II. He was in the service at the time, but he lost them in a training accident in want to say the Carolinas. But he was perfect for that part. And I think, like most people, I was most impressed or moved by the experience of watching his struggle to readjust when he got back home. Nowadays, that's not the case. I am most taken with the case of Dana Andrews, who comes back to an unfaithful wife and winds up having nothing left in his private life. He's not accepted in the way he needs to be to recover from his World War II experiences. And I think, with the exception of a couple of Hitchcocks and West Side Story, I've seen that movie more than any other. And it's another one that whenever it happens to be on TCM, I just leave it on and play it to the end. There's a very moving scene, the next to last scene in the film. His father is living with a woman. He calls his dad, but he calls this woman by her first name, so we gather it's not his own mother. And she calls to his father's attention a story about all of Dana Andrews' achievements during World War II, which the father didn't know about. Very moving film. But I have prepared this list for all of you to look over. And remember, I would have added the French Connection bullet and Judgment at Nuremberg, and some others as well. But you know, I couldn't print this thing off this morning, so I had to get it done at some point. Do any of you have any questions or comments? Oh boy. I think first hand I saw was up here. Yes, sir.
How do you rate the steak?
Oh, I like that very much. Now, I think Paul Newman made an effort to be a gentleman, and he certainly was involved with his charities. Redford was always totally inaccessible, and I know they made a really charismatic pair in Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, which went through the roof at the box office. And I was so glad that it did not beat Midnight Cowboy for Best Picture, because I thought that was another year when they got it right. But when they were paired again in The Sting, what could be more natural than putting those two guys back together again? And I thought that film worked even better. Sometimes the chemistry is just so damn good in a film that those people seem born to work together, and those two just really knew how to play off each other. And the film was so much fun anyway. Yeah, yes, sir.
Sir, I missed your first 3 or 4 minutes of your talk, but I didn't hear the word Gone with the Wind, yes. Would you kind of comment on that?
One of the great epics. My mother was never one to acknowledge any, attraction to anyone, but I knew from a very early age that she had made something of a sacrifice to get to Gone with the Wind when it was showing downtown. And although she never directly acknowledged it, I thought, I think you had a hell of a crush on Clark Gable, didn't you?
Ed, you were mentioning, right here, Ed.
Oh, okay.
You were mentioning Alfred Hitchcock is your favorite director. John Ford is mine.
Yeah.
And I think from a visual standpoint, I want your comments on it. There were 3 scenes that sort of stand in my mind. One is They Were Expendable. The lighting with Donna Reed I think is incredible. The second one, of course, is the famous scene when they're in Monument Valley. And the final one, of course, I think is the greatest ending to a movie.
The Searchers.
The Searchers with John Wayne standing in the doorway. I just want to hear your comments on that.
John Wayne has spent 2 hours out in the middle of nowhere with terrible, terrible troubles to rescue his niece, Natalie Wood, who was just a teenager then. And he brings her back home after this hellish year searching for her. He brings her home and the family embraces her and they all go into the other room and he's left alone and he just goes out the door and he holds his arm. And
I think that's one of the great endings of any movie.
that's great ending. I liked Ford's work a lot. Who wouldn't? But I understand he was a very, very difficult fellow. And Hitchcock was a very standoffish fellow. I mean, he didn't warm up to people. He loved his Grace Kelly, and he worked so well with Jimmy Stewart and Cary Grant, but he was not a people person.
I understand. Alfred Hitchcock, he made this movie with $500,000, I'm told. It's called Life Raft, where he only used... Lifeboat, rather. He only used a film of a ship sinking, and that was the end of it. The rest of it was all done in the bathtub of the Studio 57, but it pulled in millions of dollars in the market once it got released.
Can you imagine Alfred Hitchcock working with Tallulah Bankhead? That had to be one of the great bizarre mismatches of all time. Yes, sir. Oh, from the Bad Kids Road.
Ed, all these movies you've given us from the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, I want your opinion in the future, 20 years from now, because all the movies today are digital, computerized. In other words, you see all these battle scenes, and let's say Lord of the Rings, and they're all from computers. But when you saw the chariots in Ben-Hur or the action sequences in the Ten Commandments, they used actual people. Now, in the future, when we're all gone, how are they going to determine what's a great movie? Because it's all digital.
And you know, young people today have never seen anything on my list. They could not be less interested. And I still hear people comment on, that was in black and white. And
Some of the great ones were black and white.
about half of them. The kids have no sense of the stuff we grew up in. None. In my house, one singer whose records we accumulated regularly was Bing Crosby, because he was my mother's favorite. She was 100% Irish, and so was Crosby. She loved his singing, and I got to see all the Crosby movies. Excuse me. And I'll bet you not 1% of the people under 21 today have ever heard of Bing Crosby. And very few would have heard of most of the movies on this list. There's no effort to backtrack and to see the stuff. All the years I was growing up, and when I finally had access to New York, when I would get up there, and the idea would be to see 1 or 2 Broadway and off-Broadway shows a day, and to fill in with 4 or 5 films the rest of the day. So I started at 8:30 in the morning and would, if I could, even get a movie in after the evening play. And there is no sense of interest anymore in going to rep houses or seeing stuff that they have no indoctrination in.
Hey, I got...
Behind you there. Behind you. No, right here. We're using the mics.
Oh, hello.
I would like you to say a couple words about Orson Welles.
Oh, well, Citizen Kane is one of the greatest movies ever made, perhaps the single most innovative in terms of the technology and the lighting and the position. Yeah.
And just last week, I talked to my nephew, who's 19. He was forced, he said, in film class to watch Orson Welles films because they were in black and white, and he had no interest in a film that's shot in black and white. And that's from, like I say, a 19-year-old.
And Wells did one other great one, Little of Excellence followed.
Third Man.
The Magnificent Ambersons. Yeah, but Citizen Kane absolutely is up there.
And Third Man, too, I would say.
And it's not on the list. It just didn't occur to me during the 2 days I was scribbling notes. I'm sorry. It should be up there. Yeah.
Ed, when you were working for the newspapers, did you have a choice as to the films that you were going to review?
I covered absolutely everything unless the screening conflicted with something else I had to be at, like a Civic Light Opera opening or an opening at the Nixon of the Pittsburgh Broadway series or something like that. And more often than not, whatever I was having to skip was not of nearly as much consequence anyway.
Real quick, it's only my opinion, but we're seeing a lot of retreads of older movies with updated actors and updated CGI and stuff like that. Same way in the music industry. I don't see a lot of imagination anymore. Do you? Could you agree with that or disagree with it in some of the new movies you've seen?
I was cut off from pop music, mostly the 2 years I was in the Army, but certainly the year in Vietnam. Just didn't have exposure to it. And when I came back home, I plugged into a limited degree, but pop music never meant as much to me as it had up to the moment I went in the Army. And I plugged back in vigorously when I saw Saturday Night Fever, and I really liked disco. And so from Christmas of '77 until disco died at the beginning of '81, I was paying attention again. But that was, nothing else since then has fueled my interest. And by the way, I have thousands of records, 78s, 45s, 33s, a whole collection on tape, which you can't play anymore. And I understand you cannot buy an automobile anymore. And I have 100,000 on my present car, 100,300 and some. And I'm told I can't get a CD player in any. Why and what are they thinking of? Do they understand that some people want to be able to play a CD in an automobile?
Isn't that amazing? Yeah, sir. Yeah. One question, or a second question. You're home, it's a Friday night. It's very cold outside. You're by the fireplace and you have your television in front of you and your family is with you. And you want to see one movie, only one, and you have access to everything you've talked about. Which one would you choose to want to visit?
It would depend on what had never been seen by whoever I'm with. And if it's a blank slate, then it will be the best years of our lives, but you got to have the whole 3 hours to watch it.
What did you think of Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf?
Loved it. On
Yeah.
stage repeatedly, and then they made the movie, and frankly, even though I was somewhat impressed already with Elizabeth Taylor, and we all knew Richard Burton was a better actor than the films he was making, that was very, very well done.
Did you ever have a chance to interview either Taylor or Burton?
No. First of all, she didn't talk with, if she was going to communicate with anybody, it was going to be the big Hollywood press. And Burton was never accessible, and less so once he became involved with her, and they were the scandal of the decade. They were just huge together. Sorry, I should turn this off. I did get to talk with Sandy Dennis, who was in that. I loved her. Many critics disliked her because she was so quirky, but I thought it made her more interesting. And by the way, I was still happy it lost to a Man for All Seasons, which I thought was an even better movie.
Lots of great movies came out during World War II. And during the war, there were so many disruptions in families. I was 9.5 years old. We went to the Duber Theater in Canton, Ohio. My family was displaced because of the war, like so many people. I'm sorry. Sorry. And we went down to the Duber Theater in Canton, Ohio to see Casablanca.
Oh.
And I know it was a B movie. It's touted as a B movie. But nevertheless, it comes up in many conversations, and a lot of the quotes that Humphrey Bogart made and Ingrid Bergman made. And I don't know why it stands out so much in my mind, because of the times, I guess, and the trauma that was going on in the world. But nevertheless, it sticks out in my mind as one of the great movies.
It may be the most romantic of all movies. Well, it's up there with Dr. Zhivago. I know, I have a nun friend. We grew up and were in the same grade school at the same time. And she had never seen Casablanca until about a year ago. And she said, boy, that was a really good movie. And I thought, yeah, you're just a little late catching up with it. Thank you very much. Thank you. Yeah, it's a great one. The chemistry was just perfect for Bogart and Ingrid Bergman. And interestingly, she wrote later in her life, the two greatest successes she had back in that period, well, ever, were Casablanca with Bogart and The Bells of St. Mary's with Crosby. And she said, and the ironic thing is, I had no rapport with either one of them.
How about that exiting? That was unusual on Casablanca.
The ending.
They said they were waiting till the end of how.
Oh, they didn't know how it was going to end.
Yeah, and the way the two of them walked into the mist there and said,
This is the beginning of a great new friendship.
Yeah.
Wonderful ending.
right in there.
Perfect ending.
Hey, Ed, huge Steve McQueen fan. Bullet, Steve McQueen. Bullet or Great Escape?
Oh, God. You know, The Great Escape was my best picture of 1963.
I would pick, I love the car scenes in Bullet. I love that. But I love The Great Escape.
I loved all of Bullet, and I'll tell you, it's a double irony because I could not identify with McQueen at all. I think he was a prick off screen. Yeah, he was very difficult. He lived next door to his Great Escape co-star, James Garner. And I read once that he was so jealous of Garner, even though Garner was never quite as big a star. He was so jealous that he once urinated on Garner's lawn. Is it true? Well, I wasn't there, but
Your comments on two movies, please. Jack Lemmon's performance in Days of Wine and Roses and Ernest Borgnine in Marty.
I thought Marty was wonderful, and I'm so happy Borgnine won for that because these little character actors, and he was always playing bullies, as in From Here to Eternity. And when he got that break, which was, Rod Steiger had done it on TV live, and this was just the beginning of trying to take some very popular TV shows and turn them into feature films, and it worked because Marty was a big hit on was such a big hit on the art house circuit that it escaped into general release and was a big hit. And I'm glad he won for that. And the other was
Days of Wine and Roses, Jack Lemmon's act.
wonderful. And that was another case of a movie that had been done first on TV, and I liked Lee Remick so much. That was a very tough choice between Lemmon and Gregory Peck, because quite possibly because Lemmon had already won a supporting actor Oscar for Mr. Roberts. He didn't get a second one yet for Days of Wine and Roses. They gave it to Peck, who had never won. And it's hard to disagree with that choice either, because he was such a good Atticus Finch in To Kill a Mockingbird. Yeah.
Ed,
Oh,
over here.
I never got to this gentleman. Okay.
Ed, I think you'll appreciate this one. You know, being a former paratrooper, there was another B movie, like Operation Burma with Earl Flynn. And I've used this line a million times. And they were going to go and jump in Burma on one of these operations, and one fellow who hadn't jumped before asked him, well, you know, they had to give him a parachute. And without any training, and he said, well, what happens if your parachute doesn't open? And he says, well, quite simply, he said, you'll be the first one on the ground.
Good line. But, you know,
My favorite lines.
as many of the Errol Flynn films as I've seen, I never related to him comfortably. I just didn't. To me, he was like Troy Donahue later. Yes.
I'm a big fan of Turner Classic Movies. Have you ever done a cruise or had any?
Never, but a friend of mine who does a lot of acting in community productions, Warren Ashburn and his wife have been on one or two of those cruises. Thought it was worthwhile, but no, I don't want to leave Pittsburgh no matter what. And I have two elderly brothers. One is in South Jersey and the other is near Philadelphia, Doylestown. And I know I'm going to have to make a couple of trips for them, but I'm just so busy here. I just want to be here doing whatever I can get done today. Yes?
A lot of us don't know about the beginnings of the movie industry, especially the Warner Brothers Nickelodeon here in Pittsburgh. Can you give us some more facts about that we don't know about?
No. No. Of course, I wasn't around at the time. And I've stood in front of that address and wondered if this is the original building or if it was, redone later. It's bizarre that Pittsburgh had the first theater of its kind. It is. What were the Warner Brothers caring about opening a movie house here for? But for whatever reason, they did.
Why not in Newcastle?
Yeah.
And my observation is the actors, like for example, Tyrone Power, James Stewart, Clark Gable, they made their names in the 30s. But after World War II, when they came out, they were different men, and the actors. And same thing with the directors, like William Wyler, who made Days of Our Lives, am I correct?
Yes.
He never made another light comedy after what he saw the devastation in Europe. He never made those kind of movies anymore. Can you comment on it? Because you can see how they aged. Like Tyrone Power was a young man when he went in, and when he died, he wasn't even 50 years old when he died of a heart attack.
Yeah.
But they seemed like they aged. The war aged them, and like Jimmy Stewart, he had PTSD. He had to live on Henry Fonda's home after he got out of the service, and he didn't want to make Wonderful Life.
I saw a lot of Tyrone Power films. I never particularly got anything out of watching him, and I know he was considered a massive heartthrob in the 40s. But I think the most famous example of what you're describing, guys who came back from the war changed from what they had been before. Best example of that was Jimmy Stewart. Yeah. His talent so deepened from that point on, and he was perfect for It's a Wonderful Life, which was to become his own personal favorite of anything he ever did. And that's a wonderful movie.
Ed,
Yes.
a quick comment. First of all, I think it was George Stevens that was changed, would never make another comedy, because if he's the guy that filmed from D-Day to the end of the war. And Steven Spielberg was the guy that got into all of the thousands and thousands of feet of footage to use for Schindler's List that had never been seen before of, the camp scenes, the death camps. But I want to ask you a question. What do Bing Crosby, Humphrey Bogart, and Marilyn Monroe have in common? They are all descendants of a Mayflower passenger.
Oh.
How's that?
I never was going to come up with that.
They're never going to. Can you imagine Humphrey Bogart as a pilgrim? That's what I always. And Bing Crosby as a pilgrim.
Or Marilyn Monroe. Yeah.
And Marilyn Monroe.
Yeah.
We got one right here.
Yes, sir.
Ed, the technology comments notwithstanding, unfortunately, I spent 50 years working in television and film. Some of what technology has enabled today has made wonderful films, which aren't always critically acclaimed, possible. And the one that really sticks out in my mind is 1918, the film about World War I that was done 3, 4, 5 years ago that has some of the most amazing cinematography in it. I just wondered what you thought of that.
I thought it was very good. I never had an interest in watching it a second time. It is kind of a commitment of experience, but I did appreciate it, yeah. And by the way, I love George Stevens' comedy before the war, The More the Merrier. Very funny movie.
I think it has one of the most erotic scenes with Joel McRae and...
Jean Arthur.
Yeah, on the steps.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What do you think about the output nowadays? And you alluded to it a little while ago, the current movies, too much pizzazz, too many car wrecks,
I could not be less interested in the movies being released today. I will not go and see any of those superhero blockbusters. I think people should be watching movies about really good police and firefighters and people who are genuine heroes instead of these guys in suits. Tights, thank you. I couldn't have less interest in them. The real heroes of society have nothing to do with any of those cartoon characters. And we have real heroes in our society.
You haven't talked much about comedies and satire movies that have been made.
Oh yeah, the biggest hit movie that Mel Brooks made was Blazing Saddles, and I thought it was hilarious. I dragged more people to see that, but I think his masterpiece came right after that, Young Frankenstein. Oh my God, I can put that on at any point and start laughing again.
What brain did you use? Abby Normal.
Oh, yeah. And my other all-time favorite besides Young Frankenstein is It's a Mad, 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 Mad World. And I know people who said, you thought that was funny? Yes, I thought it was hilarious, and I loved seeing all those comics together. By the way, I interviewed Stanley Kramer once, and I asked him what it was like working with all those scene stealers. And he said, well, the only one I kind of had a problem with was Milton Berle. You know, there were a lot of scenes when they're all together jumping out of a cab or whatever. And he said Berle always had to hold back, so he was the last one, so he could do some crazy business that would pull the focus back to him. But I love that movie, The Big W. Yes.
Over here.
Oh, yeah.
Can you say a couple of words about Barry?
Loved his movies.
Wonderful.
Yeah. Next to Cinema Paradiso, almost all of my other favorite foreign films are Fellini. I never had a chance to talk with him. I loved his wife, Giulietta Messina. And in fact, my favorite Fellini, you'll never find any agreement on this, was the film that highlighted her, Juliet of the Spirits. But Fellini had the gift, big time. La Strada, Nights of Cabiria, 8.5, La Dolce Vita.
Well, I didn't hear you mention one of my favorites, Billy Wilder.
Oh, yeah. And Jack Lemmon loved working with him, and what a perfect combination once they got together for Some Like It Hot, and then The Apartment.
That was often considered one of the best comedies.
I would rate it number 3. I can remember going in opening day to see Some Like It Hot at Lowe's Pen and having to sit in the very back row, in the middle of the back row, and the audience was just screaming with laughter during that film. They'd never seen anything before like that scene when Marilyn Monroe is in the train compartment with Jack Lemmon. I mean, that pushed the limits as far as it could go in 1959. And that's one of the reasons 59 is one of my couple of favorite years, because it had Anatomy of a Murder, North by Northwest, and Some Like It Hot. Yes?
How about the 90-year-old Clint Eastwood? He's 90-something.
Isn't he remarkable? And apparently he's still clear, and he's made a lot of good movies. He was not ever a favorite of mine, but he did some fine films, including Unforgiven. I I didn't know him from TV at all. I'd never watched, was it Rawhide? He did. Yeah, but when I came back from the Army, he had become a big deal. And I remember going out to the Strand in Oakland to see A Fistful of Dollars coupled with For a Few Dollars More. And then right after that, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly opened. And that's one of my favorite Westerns. I don't think it's on here either. I'll keep adding to this list mentally. No, it's not. The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. Just a terrific Western. The best of the Italian Westerns. The spaghetti Westerns.
I think he'll be more known as a producer than an actor these days with $1 Million Baby and Gran Torino and some of those films.
Love $1 Million Baby. All moving. Yeah. He really could do it all. And I think he was well liked behind the scenes. And by the way, I think that of all the people, you know, I never said to somebody, did you like working with, which is a fatuous question. But people would often volunteer names, just introduce it into the conversation to say something really nice about someone. And the actor who was most often very favorably commented on was Jack Lemmon. He was a super nice man. And the woman, I would say, was mainly a TV personality, Carol Burnett. She was very gracious with all the people who came on her program. By the way, I want to tell a little Jack Lemmon story. He, after all those years of all those hit films, he went to Broadway, I think 4 times before he died. And I would spend 12 days on Broadway in the spring and 12 days in the fall. And he was just opening in something, it doesn't matter what. And I tried to get through to him, and the press agent for the show turned me down out of hand. And I was always aware that Pittsburgh was mattering less and less and less. And so I thought, my God, you have the street addresses for every theater in New York. Use it for a change. So I wrote a nice letter to Jack Lemmon, talked about the difficulty I had finding and buying the 2 record albums he had done. One was the music from Irma la Douce, which he played on the piano, and another one was a random grouping of songs, which was called A Twist of Lemon. And I finally found them both, and so I based my letter on this search for these. And the same woman who had turned me down to talk with him had to call me back and say, Mr. Lemmon has decided he'd like to talk with you. And I went to his dressing room after a show, and he was exactly what you'd expect of Jack Lemmon. Great guy.
Ed, the list that you composed, is that back here, or where is it?
I got a whole box full of them here. And I put paper clips on each set of 3, so.
Let me just carry these back.
Okay.
And so if anybody wants the list, it'll be back here.
Remember, there's a lot missing from there. But everything on that list is highly recommended. Another great epic giant, Elizabeth Taylor, Rock Hudson, James Dean. I like the epic stories that covered several years and moved from one generation to another.
We could go on for a couple of hours, I think.
One more. Good to see you. It seems that almost all the favorites you've talked about have one thing in common, and they all have great film scores.
And I collected soundtracks. Oh my goodness, the number of soundtracks I have on 33 RPM and can't play them anymore.
There's another presentation. Soundtrack.
Oh boy, except I can't discuss music from the inside.
Oh, okay. Anyway, Ed, thank you very much. Next week, we're going to have a gentleman from what's called Honor Flights. If you're not familiar with it, most of you that are veterans, these are escorted tours down to Washington, D.C. to go to the monuments and memorials to World War II, Vietnam, World War I, et cetera, et cetera. Should be an interesting talk. I've got the National Aviary coming in February. I got some things. If you want something specific you want to hear about, please get a hold of me. I know there's a lot of stories out here. If you got a story you want to tell us, let me know. We'll make it happen. So,
Thank you very much.
thank you very much, everybody.
Okay, thank you. Good seeing everyone.